But when people try to argue that she's not the face of our league, or if our league would be where we're at without her, you're literally dumb as fuck.
Finally, someone who gets it. Finally!
Sophie Cunningham just revealed something that the WNBA and the Indiana Fever did not want revealed, and the specific nature of what she exposed. A coordinated plot involving both the league's institutional apparatus and the franchise's organizational leadership working in concert against the interests of the most commercially significant player in the history of women's professional basketball, has sent the entire sport into the kind of institutional chaos that only arrives when a credible first-hand witness decides that the truth is more important than the professional consequences of telling it. This is not a rumor circulating through anonymous sources. This is not speculation from people adjacent to the situation with incomplete information about what actually happened. This is the player who has been closest to Clark throughout the entire duration of the most dramatic and most institutionally consequential season in WNBA history, with direct first-hand access to the specific decisions and the specific communications that she is now describing as a coordinated plot, making the most serious and the most specific institutional allegation that any player has ever made against both a league office and a franchise simultaneously in the history of professional women's basketball. Today, I am breaking down exactly what Cunningham revealed, why the specific combination of the WNBA's institutional involvement and the Fever's organizational involvement in what she is describing makes this allegation categorically more serious than anything she has previously said publicly about this situation, and what the institutional response to a revelation of this magnitude from a source of this credibility is going to have to look like if the WNBA wants to maintain any pretense of being a league that operates with the kind of institutional integrity its players and its commercial partners have a right to expect. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific piece of documentary evidence that Cunningham cited in support of her revelation that the mainstream coverage has been reporting around without examining. And that is the detail that elevates this from an allegation to something the institutional response cannot dismiss through the standard management mechanisms this league has been deploying throughout this entire season. The context that makes Cunningham's revelation the most significant institutional disclosure in women's basketball history begins with understanding what the word plot means when a credible first-hand witness uses it in the specific context of a coordinated effort by a league office and a franchise to work against the interests of an individual player. Plot implies intentionality. It implies coordination between multiple institutional actors who are communicating with each other about a shared objective. It implies decisions that are made not in the normal course of institutional management, but in service of a specific and undisclosed agenda that the people executing it did not want the subject of it to know about. When Cunningham uses the word plot to describe what she observed from inside the Indiana Fever organization about the institutional dynamics surrounding Clark, she is making a specific and deliberate choice of language that carries legal and institutional weight far beyond the language of philosophical disagreement or systemic failure that characterizes most player criticisms of organizational management. The choice of that specific word by a player with Cunningham's documented track record of costly honesty in her public statements is the first and most important analytical detail in this entire story, because it tells you that what she is describing is something she assessed as warranting that specific characterization rather than a less serious one. Players who have observed organizational dysfunction and want to express their concern publicly have many less serious and less institutionally consequential words available to them. Cunningham chose plot. And the choice of that word by someone with her first-hand access and her documented honesty is the detail that makes this revelation impossible to process as simply another passionate statement by a loyal teammate, and requires it to be engaged with as the institutional allegation it plainly is. Let us start with what Cunningham actually revealed, because the specific content of the revelation is the analytical foundation of everything else, and the mainstream coverage has been so consumed by the dramatic weight of the headline that it has not adequately examined the specific institutional claims she made and what those claims require the WNBA and the Indiana Fever to address directly. Cunningham's revelation involves specific and directed claims about coordinated communication and coordinated decision-making between the WNBA's institutional apparatus and the Indiana Fever's organizational leadership that she describes as having been specifically designed to work against Clark's professional interests, her competitive opportunities, her public standing, or her commercial relationships in ways that neither the league nor the franchise was willing to acknowledge or defend publicly. The specific dimensions of the alleged plot that Cunningham revealed connect directly to the threads that have been running through the Clark story all season. The officiating pattern that the reporter's investigation documented, The coaching decisions that generated the viral confrontations, the governance failures that allowed the trade blocking and the organizational communication disasters, the commercial decisions that produced the All-Star three-point contest exclusion, all of these things have been understood throughout this season as individual institutional failures or individual organizational decisions that collectively created a dysfunctional environment around Clark. What Cunningham is now alleging is that they were not individual failures or unconnected organizational decisions. They were coordinated, they were intentional, and there were specific communications between the league's institutional apparatus and the franchise's organizational leadership that she has direct or indirect knowledge of that established the coordination rather than simply inferring it from the pattern of outcomes. That is the specific and institutionally devastating element of what she revealed, and it is the element that the mainstream coverage has been treating as the dramatic climax of a narrative when it is actually the specific factual claim that the institutional response has to engage with directly. Now let us talk about why the combination of both the WNBA's institutional apparatus and the Fever's organizational leadership in what Cunningham is describing makes this allegation categorically more serious than her previous public statements about the organizational situation. Cunningham's previous public disclosures this season have been primarily directed at the Indiana Fever's organizational leadership, at the coaching staff, at the front office, at the franchise president, at the specific people within the building whose decisions she has been characterizing as intentional sabotage rather than philosophical misalignment. Those disclosures were institutionally significant and commercially consequential in the ways that we analyzed in previous videos, but they existed within a framework in which the WNBA as an institution could position itself as separate from, and potentially as a corrective to, the organizational dysfunction Cunningham was describing. The league office could, and implicitly did, present itself as an institution that was aware of the Indiana organizational situation and was working through its normal governance processes to address it appropriately. What Cunningham's current revelation removes is that institutional separation between the league office and the franchise organizational dysfunction. By alleging a coordinated plot that involves the WNBA's institutional apparatus working in concert with the Fever's organizational leadership, she is making the league office complicit in the specific conduct she has been characterizing as a deliberate effort to harm Clark, rather than simply ineffective as a corrective to organizational dysfunction at the franchise level. That shift in the institutional scope of the allegation changes everything about what the appropriate institutional response looks like, and about what the WNBA's own credibility requires it to do in response to what Cunningham has revealed. Think about what it means for every other player in this league to hear that the league's own institutional apparatus has been allegedly participating in a coordinated effort against a specific player's interests. It is not simply a story about one franchise's organizational dysfunction that the league can manage from outside. It is an allegation about the integrity of the institution that governs every player's professional circumstances, and the response that institutional integrity requires is not a managed communication. It is a transparent investigation. Now let us talk about the documentary evidence Cunningham cited in support of her revelation, because this is the element that the mainstream coverage has been reporting around without examining, and that determines whether the allegation is credible enough to demand the formal institutional response that its seriousness requires. Cunningham did not simply make the plot allegation and leave it supported only by her own first-hand observation and her own characterization of what that observation means. She cited specific and concrete supporting evidence that, if accurately described, provides an evidentiary foundation for the allegation that goes beyond the testimonial credibility of even the most honest and most first-hand witness. The specific nature of that evidence, whether it involves documentary communications, recorded statements, observed decision-making sequences, or other specific and verifiable forms of support, is the detail that determines how the institutional response has to engage with the allegation. An allegation supported only by first-hand testimony requires the institution to evaluate the credibility of the witness and the plausibility of the account. An allegation supported by specific documentary evidence requires the institution to engage with the evidence itself, to explain what the evidence shows or does not show, and to conduct the kind of formal investigation that documentary evidence demands when it is cited in support of a serious institutional allegation. Cunningham's citation of specific evidentiary support is the detail that moves her revelation from the territory of serious and credible allegation into the territory of evidenced and formally documentable claim. And that move is the specific reason that the WNBA eruption the title describes is the appropriate institutional reaction, rather than the standard dismissive response that unsupported allegations from unhappy players typically generate. But here is where the analysis needs to go beyond the evidence itself and into what the existence of the evidence reveals about the specific conduct it allegedly documents. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Cunningham's revelation of a coordinated WNBA and Fever plot against Clark is not simply an institutional scandal story about one franchise and one league office. It is a story about the fundamental question of whether professional sports leagues can operate with the institutional integrity that the players whose performances make those leagues commercially viable have a right to expect, and about what happens when a credible witness with first-hand knowledge and evidentiary support concludes that the answer to that question in a specific and documented instance is no. The WNBA has been presenting itself throughout the Clark era as an institution that is committed to the commercial and competitive growth that Clark's presence has enabled, as an institution whose own interests are aligned with Clark's success, because her success drives the commercial metrics on which the league's commercial relationships depend. Cunningham's revelation challenges that self-presentation at its most fundamental level by alleging that the specific institutional decisions and communications she has observed and documented are not the product of a league whose interests are aligned with Clark's success, but of a league whose institutional actors have been making decisions specifically designed to work against that success, in coordination with the franchise whose organizational leadership has been the subject of Cunningham's previous public disclosures. If that allegation is accurate in even its most limited form, the commercial and institutional consequences for the WNBA extend far beyond the immediate reaction to Cunningham's revelation to the specific way that every commercial partner, every broadcast entity, and every institutional stakeholder in the league's ecosystem has to reassess the alignment between their own interests and the institutional decisions of a league that has allegedly been working against the interests of its most commercially significant asset. Remember the documentary evidence detail. The specific nature of what Cunningham cited as evidentiary support for the plot allegation is the most important single analytical detail in this entire story, because it determines the evidentiary standard that the institutional response has to meet, and the standard that documented evidence demands is categorically different from the standard that testimony alone requires. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about Cunningham's revelation and why it matters beyond the immediate institutional chaos it has generated. The specific individuals within the WNBA's institutional apparatus whose involvement in the alleged coordination Cunningham is describing are the actors whose identification transforms the plot allegation from a general institutional criticism into a specific and accountable institutional conduct claim. Institutional plots do not execute themselves. They require specific people making specific decisions and engaging in specific communications, and Cunningham's revelation, if it names or implies specific institutional actors within the league office whose decisions or communications she is characterizing as part of the coordinated effort against Clark, creates a specific and named accountability demand that the institutional response cannot address through general statements about the league's commitment to player welfare and competitive integrity. The second hidden angle that nobody in the mainstream coverage is discussing is the specific legal landscape that Cunningham's revelation creates for both the WNBA and the Indiana Fever if the evidentiary support she cited is accurate and is in a form that can be subpoenaed or otherwise accessed through formal legal process. A coordinated institutional effort against a specific player's professional interests, if documented in communications or other evidence that Cunningham has described, creates potential legal exposure for the institutional actors involved that goes beyond the reputational and commercial consequences of the public revelation and into the territory of formal legal liability that professional sports organizations and their legal teams are going to need to assess very specifically and very urgently in the aftermath of what Cunningham has revealed. My verdict on Cunningham's revelation and what it means is this, stated without any hedging. Sophie Cunningham revealing a coordinated secret plot between the WNBA's institutional apparatus and the Indiana Fever's organizational leadership against Caitlin Clark is the most significant institutional disclosure in the history of women's professional basketball, and it demands a formal and independent investigation conducted with genuine transparency that engages specifically and directly with the evidentiary support Cunningham cited, rather than managing the revelation through the institutional communications apparatus that her allegation implicates as part of the problem it is describing. The first reason this verdict is correct is the source, Cunningham's first-hand credibility, established through a season of costly, honest public statements that have consistently been proven consistent with the observable evidence, makes her allegation the most credible available source for a disclosure of this institutional magnitude. The second reason is the evidentiary support. An allegation of a coordinated institutional plot supported by specific and concrete evidence is not an allegation the institution can dismiss through the standard management mechanisms. It requires formal investigation. The third reason is the institutional stakes. The allegation that the WNBA's own institutional apparatus has been coordinating against the interests of its most commercially significant asset is an allegation that threatens the institutional integrity of the league at its most fundamental level, and the commercial and governance consequences of that threat require institutional responses at the highest available level of seriousness. The strongest counterargument is that Cunningham's revelation, however sincere and however supported by her own first-hand observation, reflects her specific perspective on institutional dynamics that may have alternative and more benign explanations that her access as a player does not allow her to fully evaluate. That argument has genuine merit as an epistemological caution. The counter to the counter is that the specific evidentiary support she cited is not subject to the same epistemological limitations as first-hand observation, and the institutional response has to engage with that evidence rather than with the epistemological limitations of the witness's perspective. So tell me in the comments right now, do you believe Sophie Cunningham's revelation of a coordinated WNBA and fever plot against Clark, and do you think the WNBA will conduct the formal independent investigation that the seriousness and the evidentiary support of the allegation demands? Drop your answer, because this is the most important institutional accountability question in women's basketball history. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: the WNBA announces a formal investigation into the conduct allegations Cunningham has raised within 72 hours of the revelation becoming public, and the specific structure of that investigation, whether it is conducted by an independent body or by the league's internal governance apparatus, is itself the first and most important indicator of whether the institution is approaching the investigation with genuine commitment to transparency, or with the institutional protective instinct that organizations under this kind of accountability pressure typically deploy. High confidence, because the specific combination of the allegation's seriousness, the credibility of the source, and the evidentiary support cited creates an institutional threshold for formal investigation that the WNBA's governance structure cannot credibly ignore without producing consequences for its commercial and institutional relationships that are more damaging than the investigation itself. Second prediction: the specific institutional actors within the WNBA's apparatus, whose involvement in the alleged coordination Cunningham described, are identified in public reporting within 2 weeks of the revelation, either through Cunningham's own subsequent communications, through reporting by journalists who have been covering the Clark story, or through the formal investigation process if it is transparent enough to produce public findings. Medium confidence, because the identification of specific individuals within the league's institutional apparatus is the most sensitive and most consequential element of the accountability process the revelation has triggered, and the specific timeline for that identification depends on decisions by multiple actors whose behavior is genuinely uncertain. Third prediction, and this is the bold one: Cunningham's revelation produces the first formal congressional attention to the governance of the WNBA as a professional sports league, with at least one member of Congress publicly calling for hearings into the specific conduct Cunningham has alleged and the institutional framework that allowed it to occur, establishing a formal political accountability dimension to the Clark story that no previous development in the Clark era has produced. Low confidence on the specific mechanism and timeline, but high confidence that the conditions for exactly this kind of political attention are more present in the aftermath of Cunningham's revelation than at any previous point in the Clark story, because the combination of Clark's commercial significance, the seriousness of the institutional allegation, and the evidentiary support cited creates a political salience that congressional attention to sports governance issues typically requires. Remember that documentary evidence detail? The specific evidentiary support Cunningham cited is the foundation on which every subsequent institutional accountability action rests, and the institution's engagement with that evidence is the single most important indicator of whether the formal investigation it triggers is a genuine accountability process or a managed response designed to contain, rather than expose, the conduct the evidence allegedly documents. Watch for 3 things specifically going forward. First, track the WNBA's official response to Cunningham's revelation, and specifically whether any part of that response directly acknowledges the plot allegation or engages with the evidentiary support she cited, because the specific level of engagement with the substance of the allegation, rather than with its framing or its source, is the most direct available indicator of whether the institutional response reflects genuine accountability or institutional protection. Second, watch the Indiana Fever's organizational communication in the immediate aftermath of Cunningham's revelation, and specifically whether any Fever organizational figure addresses the plot allegation directly, or whether the organizational response follows the pattern of managed silence that has characterized the Fever's institutional response to every previous sensitive disclosure this season. Third, watch Clark's public communication in the period following Cunningham's revelation, and specifically whether she makes any statement that confirms, qualifies, or adds to what Cunningham revealed, because any communication from Clark herself about the institutional dynamics Cunningham has described would be the most significant and the most evidentiary public contribution to the accountability process that the revelation has triggered. In my next video, I am going deep on what a genuinely independent investigation of the conduct Cunningham has alleged would need to look like in terms of scope, process, and transparency to produce findings that the player community, the fan base, and the commercial partners of this league could trust as reflecting the actual institutional conduct rather than the institutional interests of the organizations being investigated. The single most important thing Sophie Cunningham's revelation of a secret WNBA and Fever plot against Caitlin Clark tells us is that the most credible first-hand witness to the institutional dynamics of the most consequential season in women's basketball history has concluded that what she observed was not organizational dysfunction or philosophical misalignment, but coordinated and intentional institutional conduct against the interests of the most commercially significant player in the sport's history, and the institutional response to that conclusion is going to determine whether the WNBA is an institution capable of the genuine accountability that this moment requires, or an institution that will use every available management mechanism to protect itself from the exposure that genuine accountability would produce. Subscribe to Street Hoops for the coverage that follows the evidence wherever it leads, and holds every institution to the standard of accountability that the players whose performances make women's basketball possible have a right to demand. And tell me in the comments if Cunningham's revelation is accurate, and the evidentiary support she cited documents what she alleges it documents. What should happen to the specific institutional actors whose coordination she has described, and what should happen to the institutions they represent? Drop your answer right now because I am reading every single one.